All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today as we kick off the spring semester and our second installment of the Disentangling Disinformation series. Disentangling Disinformation, or DD as we've lovingly come to call it, is a series that began in the fall and in an immediate sense was born out of the current global moment, but it's a reflection of societal shifts that have been taking place over time and have made themselves much apparent of late. Disinformation is an unshakable reality of our time. We live in an era where the confines of understanding are not limited to a lack of information, but a bombardment of countering narratives. It can be daunting to sift through the barrage of messaging, leaving room for the simple yet harmful decision to ignore it all. There's countless information that shelters what's happening in the world, and thus disinformation is costing us the ability to stay accurately informed. This series of teach-ins aims to provide tools to navigate the current landscape of media, make sense of what we see, what we don't see, and what may be in conflict within us amidst a continuing practice of self-education. In the fall, we engaged with speakers on humanitarian aid, hate speech online, and video journalism. And we have a great series set up for the spring. We're so glad to have Nataliya to start it off today. We'll approach topics like doxing, the power of language, and terrorism this spring, among many other topics from many disciplines. You can see the whole program on the Peace and Development website. We'll also share the link in the chat. This series has come together as a combined effort from the Program on Peace and Development at Yale University, MADE, which stands for Mass Atrocities in the Digital Era, which is part of the Genocide Studies program at Yale, and the Department of Social Justice Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that those of us based out of Yale University are privileged to operate in. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scoticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. My name is Hera Jaffrey. I'm glad to meet you all and be a representative of our sponsoring organizations, and I'll pass it over to my colleague to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Hera. It's really, for me, I'm so glad that you are the force behind this this series. I think it's an especially important one. It's the right series for our time, and these are certainly challenging issues. I'm David Simon. I'm the director of the Genocide Studies program and one of the co-founders of MADE, which Hera had mentioned. And it is, for me, a tremendous privilege to be able to be introducing Nataliya Gumenyuk today. She's a Ukrainian journalist and an author specializing in conflict reporting. She's reported from over 50 countries, regularly writing for The Guardian, Vanity Fair, The Washington Post, Rolling Stone, New York Times, and The Atlantic. She was the co-founder and the head of the independent Ukrainian Hromadske, I said that right? Hromadske TV and Hromadske International. She's currently a board member for Hromadske. She's the founder and the CEO of the Public Interest Journalism Lab, or PIJL, which promotes constructive discussion around complex social issues. After the full-scale Russian invasion just over 2 years ago, Nataliya started working with Janine Giovanni and Peter Pomerantsev to co-found The Reckoning, Ukraine Testifies, which documents war crimes committed during the war. The Reckoning Project's documentaries have appeared in Time, Vanity Fair, in the New York Times. I'm privileged to serve on the board of the Reckoning Project. And when I joined, numerous people said, you've got to meet Nataliya Gumenyuk. She's wonderful. She's the force that makes it go, and be a valuable connection for understanding Ukraine conflict beyond. And my experiences with her have sort of borne that out. In 2023, under Gumenyuk's leadership within the Connecting the Continents initiative, PIJL, the Public Interest Journalism Lab, brought to Ukraine senior editors, public intellectuals, and journalists from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Nataliya is the author of several documentaries and books, including The Lost Island, Tales from the Occupied Crimea, and the Maidan Tahrir on development after the Arab Spring, as well as co-author of the book The Scariest Days of My Life, The Dispatches of the Reckoning Project. She is the recipient of a 2022 NED Democracy Award, a 2022 Media Freedom Award, and a 2023 Hanns Joachim Friedrichs Prize. Nataliya, I'm so glad that you're able to join us for, I guess, this evening for you in Ukraine, this afternoon for us in New Haven, today for wherever people are joining us. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts on these topics.
Thank you. Sorry, I feel kind of a bit embarrassed to have such a lengthy introduction, but indeed, maybe it helped a bit to tell what we are doing and what I would insert. But I want also maybe to be useful in this conversation and to speak more about the unique knowledge me and thanks to my team, I gained covering this war for already 10 years and speaking about the knowledge about disinformation, the word which we Ukrainians know for the last decade, which is our everyday kind of world. But fortunately, it was not like that for everybody in 2015. And now speaking in the context of the full-scale Russian invasion and working in the documentation of the war crimes, but I want to start about something which occurred to me years ago, because I really yesterday we considered the beginning of the Russian invasion, because that was the day when the Russian troops pretended they pretended they were not the Russian troops, but they occupied Crimea. And I was one of the first journalists, not one of the first journalists, but who came from Kiev to Crimea, and I kept reporting from the peninsula for the next 5 years. But I remember very vividly one of the moments which was extremely shocking for me. The peninsula is, a southern part of Ukraine, and they usually had a scarcity. They didn't have enough water. Historically, they don't have like a good groundwater, so the waters were flowing from the Ukrainian mainland to Crimea. And at the moment of the annexation, occupation, when everything was very volatile, in one of the villages, there were some rumors that, oh, what would happen if Russia would occupy and Crimea and the territory would be cut down from the rest of the Ukraine, maybe there won't be water. And I heard in one of the villages the debate between two residents of that village of particular age, and one was saying that, and one was insisting, like, don't worry, there is an underground lake under our village. And the second one was telling, like, but there is no underground lake in our village. It just doesn't exist. It didn't exist. The lake didn't exist. That was a fact. But for me, this idea that somebody would debate something very basic, it's like, we live in the village. It's either there is or there is no. It's not a point of view. That was very, very, disturbing, even surreal. But unfortunately, I should say that it looked at the time pretty harmless. Looking in the late years later, it was a showcase that if you really want, you actually may force people to believe in anything. And the unfortunate occupation of Crimea was probably for us one of the start. It was not like just the start of everything, but I remember in particular for the international audience, I think it took a year. I was in the United States maybe later within the year or after the invasion, and still in very good, important discussion, we really need to prove that it was not the locals in Crimea, but the Russian troops which occupied it. Now we don't need to prove it. You know, it's clear, it has happened. There is a court decision of the European Courts of Human Rights that the invasion happened on the 26th of February 2014. But we lived in the first year of the full-scale of the invasion, not full-scale invasion, but 2014 invasion. I remember that myself, being a Ukrainian journalist, but still communicating a lot with international press, we actually wasted, and I use this word, wasted a year of trying to explain to the Western journalists who were there, who were in Crimea, who were listening, that, you know, in fact, sometimes the Kremlin tells something which is a total scam, a total lie. But that's one of the things. Yet, so the idea of the alternative reality is actually really harmful. But for me, also, is important that if you don't stop it in the early stage, if you let it grow, it leads to something way more dangerous. And for the next years, I was still, you know, a bit hesitant, and was saying that, look, we journalists, we are so, you know, concerned about our craft, our vocation, and we often says that the word kills, but in fact, you know, people are killed by the bombs, people are killed by the weapon, and if there would be just the Russian disinformation and there won't be Russian troops, we should also understand, if there won't be the troops with the weapon, disinformation itself wouldn't do much. Yet I think, since what is very important is to differentiate the information as such and the information which goes together with the capabilities of any particular force. In this regard, we can speak about the Russian state, but it could be any particular group which has the capability to change the reality according to their own propaganda. So, you know, I maybe would be in these debates, you know, what is the alternative point of view, what the Russians are saying, what the Kremlin is saying. But when it goes together with the arms, with breaching the law, it becomes very, very, very dangerous. And the development, and I always was like insisting that, look, we should look at the disinformation, we should, you know, we should really differentiate disinformation, we should differentiate propaganda, but we also should differentiate it when such things are used by particular groups which have money, which have power, which have resources to use the force, but support their words with actions. We have a lot of, you know, Kremlin propaganda and the disinformation after the full-scale invasion. But we also understood that they started to use it in more, you know, dangerous way. So beyond telling some invented things or debunking some of the things, we found some new ways how it's used, and what's going on. Using the information and using propaganda and disinformation as an alibi before committing the crimes. Now we're working within the Reckoning project, which is to explain it very simple, we work with the analysts and lawyers, but we field reporters, talk to direct survivors and the witnesses of the war crimes, meticulously writing down what happened with the person A or person B, with asking the questions in a very neutral way. So we documenting, you know, what we claim to be the historic truth, if it's historic truth to extent it's possible, which is verifiable. But we're also looking, you know, we can speak about the huge, incredible evidence and amount of the war crimes committed on Ukrainian territory. But what we see as well, that really partially the propaganda and the disinformation enable some of this crime. On the 9th of March, we would commemorate such a tragic event as the attack on the maternity ward in Mariupol, where people were killed in such a, you know, fragile place as the place where women are given birth to the kids. And it's a pretty famous story. The film about Mariupol in March 2022 is currently now listed is an Oscar nominated. But what we also remember that prior to those events, for a couple of days in the Russian media, by the Russian propagandist media, there was a talks that in this maternity ward, there are some kind of alleged Nazi battalion is trying to find an asylum. It was not true. There were neither Nazi nor any military in this maternity ward, but creation of that idea partially enabled, and when the attack has happened, there was already this buzz that something is wrong with that place. And if it was not the case for us, it was definitely the case for many people in Russia. The other things of similar kind were happening when prior to different other attacks. And for instance, I personally was working on the number of the stories, and one of them is the story about attack on the train station in Hromadske. It's a town in eastern Ukraine, which was a vocal point for the evacuation during the first months of the war, where a lot of people from eastern Ukraine were going. There were like 5,000-8,000 people every day on that train station. The train system is extremely developed in Ukraine. They were finding the refugee at that station. And at that time, the train stations were really the places for the displaced and for people who want to leave. So if you look later to the social media and to the different announcement of the Russian officials, a few days before and a day before and some hours before, they were really telling that, there was there are some Ukrainian troops at that train station. Unfortunately, 59 people were killed on the spot and 120 were injured, and over 3,000 people who stayed in the station were the witnesses of very horrific event, because the munition was used which really target the human body. It couldn't target a weapon or various kind of vehicles or something. So it still remains one of the most of the horrific events which has happened, like a one-time attack. But what for me was interesting, that later, even when we many organizations, many media didn't want to work with this topic, because they said, like, but there was something. Is it like clear war crime? There was something about the Ukrainian military being there. It was a busy period. It was not such a clear case as, for instance, like the case of torture or even like the maternity ward. It's true that, somewhere near the station, somewhere there was some military vehicle, but not even the tanks. And we were able to identify that the weapon which has been used by the Russians was not the weapon which was capable to destroy some, metal. It was really like against the humans. But this impression which has been created remained. And this blur that something is wrong with that place, maybe you don't need to go there, maybe you don't need to investigate, really worked. So I really think that we really need to thoroughly think of the new ways how the disinformation and how the propaganda is actually enabling crimes and often used as an alibi. And that's something new in this war for us. I would also speak a bit more that I probably didn't underestimate it for a while myself, the whole idea of the crime of denial. Because it's true that there is a Holocaust denials. There are the people who would say Srebrenica didn't happen, genocide in Rwanda didn't happen years after, and people would be shocked. Within the Reckoning Project itself, we all, thinking that we are working very hard to prevent this crime of denial, and what we recorded, it's already 2 years since some of the events which happened, at least like the publishing in the articles and publishing it in the, doing the films or the book we did, would probably at least like tell that no, these things happened. But I wouldn't underestimate how traumatic this experience should be for survivors. One of the first articles I wrote, I think it was the first article I wrote, it happened that about the full-scale invasion. I published it at 9 a.m. London on the February 24th. I started it to write after I heard the first bombs in Kiev. And I think it was on the cover of The Guardian next day, together with a different article, with a big picture of the lady from eastern Ukrainian town of Chuguyev. It was probably one of the first iconic images of the Ukrainian war, the women with the face in blood. And I particularly mentioned that photo because my article went along with it. And it happened that this lady was the mother of the classmate of my former colleague. I saw on Facebook that my former colleague said like, oh, it's a mother of my classmate. So I obviously wanted to follow up and wrote to the girl saying like, oh, I want to tell the story for The Guardian further, what happened to your mother, how she is. And she said like, look, we are actually like, don't really want to talk at this stage, because as long as I posted this photo, she and myself on Instagram, we are bombarded by various Russian trolls and other people that it's not true, it's fake, and it's, for me, it's okay, it's actually very painful. And that was my first time when I thought like, yeah, in fact, I maybe here in Kiev fully understand that this happened, but maybe for this particular lady who lives, and also they live in the town very close to the Russian border, maybe they have the relatives and it's very emotional moment, but it was also very painful and traumatic experience. And I started to follow up the stories. I've seen this photo later as well in a very specific way. One of the crimes we recorded and documented, one of the tragic events we documented, which was published by the Time magazine later. It was about the one village in Ukraine, in the northern region, which for 1 month has been occupied by the Russian troops. And the whole village was kept in the basement for 1 month in a very humiliating conditions. And I've been also one of the first reporters who came to the village some days after its liberation. The bridges were blown up, so it took some time to reach it from Kiev. And it was not the first time, but in the base and around the school, and schools were often in different villages used by the Russian military. It was full of, it was rainy, so it was full of the newspapers, Komsomolskaya Pravda, the most popular Russian publication. And, with a justification that why the special operation was launched. And this was a piece of the publication which was full of various propaganda. And there was this photo of this lady with the news like fake. And later we talked with one lady in the village who told like that she talked to the Russian soldiers, and when they were giving this this newspaper to them, she argued with them like, look, I understand that here is not a news about Yahidne, but it's happening to us. It's really in these articles, it's written that what is happening to us is fake. And so I really want to stress that we shouldn't underestimate that it's really the crime to deny the people the right to be considered themselves victims. But for me, I later started to follow up and look at this publication And I found a very similar paper in various places which Russians abandoned. It went on. It was a special edition, but then with a different date, a similar papers occurred. What was for me also very important to say that there is a difference between the disinformation and propaganda, but there could be some responsibility for this, because wherever you say this paper first was given to the Russian soldiers, so they would justify what they do, but it also was given to the people to brainwash them, let's say like that. And this paper had the name of the editor. It was published with 7 million copies. It has the name of the copy editor, the build editor, the people who worked on that. And for me, it's extremely important to say that I do believe that they have the responsibility for what has happened. And I think it's one of the ways to deal with this is, to move out of the discussion about the disinformation and propaganda and the responsibility for the particular use of misinformation. It should be the legal issue. It should be, probably connected with the accountability, investigation, and the crime. So I'm not really definitely talking about, suing somebody or legal case for somebody who speak or tell. But if such of the things are enabling crimes, and it's happening now, I do think that we can't totally ignore. And David mentioned that, I also last year welcome to Ukraine the delegations from various continents, including Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And when I had a chance to be in some of the African countries last year, in Kenya, for instance, and South Africa, I really talked to the journalists from there. And they would speak about RT, the Russian, one of the major political outlets and mouthpiece. They were still trying to compare it to Fox News, to anything else. And we can have doubts about the biased media, the media with agenda, the media which also spread some of the views which we disagree, or even the spread direct lies. But I think that the difference should be that if, for instance, in case of RT, there is a clear call for particular criminal actions, as it happens by Margarita Simonyan, who is the head of the station, that's probably could be different if there would be the court case or anything against this publication, particularly where there would be the difference that this is not just an opinion. I'll be rounding up, but there are some couple of other things to say, because I really want to really say that I strongly believe that there is a difference in how we work with disinformation in the democratic societies and how it's worked in the societies which is controlled. To be honest, prior to full-scale invasion, especially in 2020, these years, after 5-6 years of the war in Ukraine, even though it was just in the part of the territories, I myself was a bit tired of the whole idea about disinformation. It became a bit boring of speaking about the debunking news, about fact-checking. And I strongly, firmly believe that just debunking as such, it just helps to, keep the same narrative. And if you believe in something and somebody just want to debunk, it doesn't work that way. I strongly believe in the idea of good journalism as the way to move forward, but the good journalism which looks into the complicated issue and looking at the issues which maybe are traumatic or problematic. And I'm also concerned that one of the biggest problems of modern disinformation and modern age information is really the polarization of the societies, that the commercial model, classical commercial model of the media really keeps the people in their bubbles, and even the commercial model of some publication is worked into the creating the community of like-minded people who consume the information which they want to consume. And therefore, when we were creating and launching the Public Interest Journalism Lab in 2020, we were trying to move from the idea of just independent outlet which know what is the right thing to do, and has a very strong partisan idea of how the thing should be in the country, into a more nuanced way of dealing with the complex issues in Ukraine. Would it be the reaching out to the population living in occupied territories, how to speak about traumatic past and history to the audiences which usually do not agree with each other. It happened that at that time, the COVID pandemics hit the world at the moment when we were creating our organization. But even during the war, I returned to this very same experience, which we did. So what we started to do, we wanted to combine journalism with sociology and with the research. So we thought that maybe there are some problems we do not understand our audience, and can we really, produce the content, not just good content, and we believe it would be, everybody would accept it, but maybe, there are complicated issues like the occupation or vaccination or anything like that. We can produce some pieces of the news, visuals or text, and then show it to various focus groups and to and see, do the people respond, how people respond to that. And in summer 2020, we came with the hypothesis that sooner or later the vaccine would be invented. It was not yet. And there would be, our concern was some people wouldn't believe that vaccine would be useful. So at that time, the dominant idea was that there are these lunatics, very crazy people who don't believe in the vaccinations. And probably there is some disinformation going on, and these are conspiratorial people who by default believe in crazy things, and they definitely won't be vaccinated, and how to deal with that. We made a poll with some of our colleagues from Kharkiv Sociological Institute for Social Research. And when we were doing the poll within the next half a year and research, we figure out that obviously there are some extreme, there are people who are prone to conspiratorial thinking, and maybe there were 7% of our respondents. But most of the people who had doubts, they have quite a legit doubts. And actually their doubts were very simple. They didn't know whether they can do vaccine when, for instance, somebody is pregnant, or when somebody has too many disease, or when somebody is elderly, or what is the difference of these vaccines, or maybe would it be free, would it be too expensive? People had all kind of the issues. But what we felt that often the media were mocking the audience, and especially some of the very progressive independent Ukrainian media outlets later were producing reports about the vaccination and the debunking reports about the vaccination in a way that they were laughing at the audience. And when people looked at this report, they said, like, look, they're very primitive. I don't believe that I would have the horns if I would have vaccine. I have like very clear question. And I would give it as an example why all of a sudden I'm speaking about that. Since then, I'm using this as an example for so many stories. Now, for instance, in Ukraine, one of the big issues for the war is the military draft. It's like actually why people would go to serve and would risk their life. And some people don't want. And it's not because they don't like their country. It's not because they're cowards. I would have the very same question that it's not because there is some disinformation. I do believe firmly that people, have some of their doubts and concerns, and often media forget to address very reasonable doubts and concerns. The very same things when we were working with the history, or we were doing prior to this war, to the big war, the documentaries on the recent Ukrainian traumatic history, and we wanted to do the stories on how to tell the recent traumatic history of Ukraine. Would it be the complicated 80s and the reforms in the country, which were connected to the huge poverty, to various populations, to elderly who are nostalgic about the past, to people who are very, anti-communist. And what we figure out that people generally today are very, very majority, many people are ready to accept complicated issues, but they don't like to hear when they are told how it should be. What they are ready to hear is the individual stories where people from the first account tell about their experience. And when we were measuring with sociologists the trust, we could really very much hear that any narration, when the generalization with the narratives were not considered, not accepted very well by the audience. However, they were ready to hear a person with whom they disagree, but who told in the as one person his or her personal story. Why it's for me important, and I again recall to this experience this year, while welcoming the journalists and intellectuals from Brazil and Argentina, from South Africa and Nigeria, from Singapore and Indonesia, they have their own ways to see the world. They have some different views on they still sometimes see this war in this Cold War optics. They would have a lot of questions about NATO, the US involvement. But as long as you start to speak about the human stories and human suffering, there was something which they really related like that. A Nicaraguan journalist who was in Ukraine for a couple of hours, talking to the teacher from southern town in Ukraine, Kherson, who has been tortured, right away told me that's exactly how people are treated in the prisons in Nicaragua. And the people could relate. So I believe in our world, in today's world, and why I also like so much to do what we are doing within the Reckoning Project, just to say that there is the factual recording and proper storytelling of what's happening when you really look into the very much verified but story which can be relatable to the person, is probably one of the best way to tell the story rather than enforce and debunk. And that's for me would be still the major way. So wherever we speak about disinformation and propaganda, again, like I would separate the idea of the accountability and enabling the crimes, and the idea that I firmly believe that factual journalism with in-depth approach, with very thoughtful way, and the respect to the audience, and looking into the needs of the audience, can be the way out. I would finalize with that. Our organization is called Public Interest Journalism Lab. Very let's say not very easy to run the organization with that last and long name, but it means what it means. And the public interest, we actually experimenting with how the journalism can be useful. And I believe that to compete it's very hard for journalists today when the media lost the monopoly for the broadcasting, for television broadcasting, for radio frequency, and the internet is decentralized, which is not bad. When we lost this monopoly, including like with the big papers, we compete with entertainment, we compete with opinion journalism, which might be, and we compete with all the social media and all the unverified and factually incorrect information and disinformation, and a lot of we can speak in hours how the information is misused by the algorithm. But I think that one of the way some people would say, like, let's do the journalism more entertaining. I don't really believe in that much. I think we just you still if you have a Super Bowl wherever you want to entertain, you won't compete with a film, with a series, with a football match. But what we can do, we can be useful. So I think that, for instance, there is the project of record for us. I believe it's useful because not just it enable and helps the survivors to tell their story, but also it's used in a way that the lawyers can use it, and there is really like a practical use of the storytelling, but also of the collection of the documenting using the journalistic tools. But it could be not like just like that. I think during the war, like ours, we can't underestimate how much of the information, how much the information is needed to the people. Would it be the information on how to survive, where to go, where to find things, or sometimes information which can connect the people? I can also separately say that, you know, the wars divide society. Ukrainian society is incredibly united, but still there were people who left the territory. There were people who stayed in the occupation. It's a different choice. The local head of the village would be accused of abandoning the village, you know, because he left, but it was the only way for him or her to live. Otherwise, in different cases, the village heads were abducted under the Russian occupation. And I think what we can do is really just let those people to speak between themselves and enable the honest conversation. And that won't be done by the politicians. It won't be done by the, you know, just by activists. It's actually the role of journalism. And if not, in this vacuum, people would believe in all the gossips, all the rumors. So I honestly think that I'm thinking about the journalism as a service, as something very practical. And I can in length speak how crazy is the Russian propaganda in the occupied territories, how they just invent things, how they create surreal alternative reality where there is a lake, where there is no lake. But if I would be sitting in Kiev and telling like, hey guys, don't believe that in your village, there is no lake in your village, don't believe them, I don't think I would reach them anyways, because people are so busy with their everyday survival. I probably would need to find a way to tell them, you know, how to survive in that place, what are the ways to leave from that place, what they can count on if they manage to get to the Ukrainian and government controlled territory. So I really think that there is, with this abundance of information, when also all these malign forces want to bury the truth and bury the things in this huge amount of the disturbing, chaotic, and not correct information, that there is, you know, we can speak about this attention, short attention span, but I think for me, the one way to get into that is really be very, very thoughtful and respectful on how you get to the people by serving them in one of the way. Not everybody should document war crimes. Somebody do local journalism. Somebody tell the story. But just having this idea that every day when we do it for something, I do think this is one of the best way for media, at least for journalists, is to overcome disinformation. And of course, we need to research more because it's updated the way how the propagandists work. We need to know some, you know, we need to be very much aware how technology works, but that probably would be beyond this discussion. And I'm speaking quite long compared to how I promised to do that. I'm free to answer the questions.
Oh, thank you so much. We appreciate it so much. I'm sure there's plenty of questions in the audience, so I'll give everyone a second to enter them in. There's that little Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, so please feel free to enter any thoughts or questions you have in there. And David and I can maybe start off with our own thoughts. I have one question which comes to my mind, sort of as you were talking about sort of good journalism is the way to move forward. And I think about in the American system, and I think about how we've been responding to disinformation here. A lot of people have turned to their local news outlets as opposed to maybe some of these larger national outlets as a way to kind of like a trusted source for their information. And I wonder if kind of in Ukraine, sort of how the kind of reporting structures are, if there's like a similar model where there's kind of these local models that people are turning to for their information that may be maybe less touched, if that makes sense.
I strongly believe that, you know, the death of the local journalism is the death of democracy in a way in the countries where it is. And in fact, why it's also working, because the local journalism is something people can check and relate. This is like the trust building mechanism. You can't check what's going on in DC, but you can check if it's real or not, if it's a local paper. In Ukraine, unfortunately, you know, Ukraine regained its independence in 1991, and the first 10 years were very, you know, hard in terms of finance. So we kind of lost the moment of developing good print media. We already went to the television era from the very beginning. So I think like up to 3% in Ukraine read papers. It's very little. It became already television, which became dominant and controlled by various political forces, and then internet came. There is a good online journalism. It's actually the good online journalism in Ukraine was always pivotal, and probably it was always stronger because you didn't have people much in print, so they were all good people were online. We have now the phenomenon of the Telegram news, the messengers. There are concerns to what extent they are reliable, and there are a lot of unreliable sources, and you know they're kind of working as a tabloid media. But our local journalism is done by the messengers. That's really true, and it's very interesting. In some cases, when, for instance, in one of the town, which is in the North Ukraine, it's where all the employees of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant work, Slavutich. When the city was, you know, under the Russian occupation, I think they have there were 7,000 members of this Viber chat, and it was like a local paper. Can you imagine? It's like the whole town is in one chat. I find it like phenomenal if you really speak about the journalism. It's probably not acute like that, but I think that we have the village chats like that. So I think the idea is how to work in the best way. And I know there are some ideas to have this hyper community quality media. In some places it worked when there were people who managed to launch it in some way. There were people who managed to launch it who were not professional journalists and then misused these chats. So it's really, I think, like if you're not doing anything in the vacuum, something would be created, and that would be very difficult to challenge that.
The issue of those, if I can jump in, Ira, the issue of those chats, the sort of semi-public groups, it's fascinating from a legal perspective, because even if there's actual incitement going on, it may not be actionable because it's not technically public. It's a although that's an argument to be made in a legal court, I suppose. But I think you really hit on something that is, and it kind of actually flips Hira's hope for international or for local journalism as the answer, as part of the solution, on its head, because if these networks are very localized, it's a way, but unaccountable. I mean, it strikes me that the networks on a WhatsApp chat or any other chat like that are in the hands of the people who created them, and very amenable to, there's no sort of public accountability there. To me, that sounds extraordinarily frightening, that one of the virtues of public journalism is that you're accountable, in theory, to counterpoints that are contributed from the public. So how do you, if a village level chat group is sort of in the hands of a disinformationist, what can be done? Can you, I mean, create another a counter chat? What's the strategy?
Yes, I think that that would be the strategy. That would be the right strategy. And I still think that we are better, as long as we start to work professionally, we can compete because we know how to do it. And contrary to somebody who would sit on the chat, and why sometimes some of the journalists became very, famous and followed during this war, that a guy who is moderating the chat just connect the things from internet and put it sitting probably in front of the laptop. But I'm a journalist. I'll go, I'll meet, I'll talk, I'll ask the right question. And I think that's the way. I remember one thing you mentioned, that like in Ukraine in 2014, we created this media outlet Hromadske, which was like Hromadske means public. It's like the idea that online public television. And what was very interesting at that time, it was authoritarian. We're going down to becoming an authoritarian state, and all the famous reporters were pushed away. So we were a dozen of, some more famous, some not, but some of us were very famous reporters who joined and decided to create this network. And it was Facebook and Twitter at that time, not Telegrams yet. Yet even not YouTube was not that big. And the issue was that then we became super popular, and a lot of foreign reporters were coming and trying to present us. And there is this citizen journalist group of, guys using the Facebook because it was after the Arab Spring, and everybody wanted to write the same story. And I told, like, guys, the point is a bit different. You have the major political correspondent, and he is asking the right question to the number one, opposition leader. So of course, because he has access and he asks the right question. Yes, he uses Twitter, but if he would be just the guy from the street, neither he would have the access, neither the question would be right, neither what he writes can be verified. So I think we really need to do that about and that's why I think that still, if you want to, I'll tell a bit different story. And sorry for being long, but I think in these stories, that's how it works. Bakhmut, you heard about this town. It's sad for me to understand that it doesn't exist any longer. Very nice town, 70,000 people live, and I've been in touch just prior to the big war. We were mentoring and working with one young publishing house, Radio Bakhmut. Very nice, kind of hipsterish kids from the locals who were doing this radio, which was the radio for this territory, but also on the occupied territories. They were popular, but they were a bit concerned that, people don't read us very much because they don't want to read important stories. We want to tell them important stories, but somehow they don't relate to the important stories. And we were chatting and thinking, and also using some Western and expertise, saying that, like, learn what your people want. So we're trying to create this engagement journalism when they talk to they have the meeting with the residents of Bakhmut and ask, what do you want to know? What are the top news? Can you send the list of the topics? And in fact, people wanted to, they found out that there is one topic everybody was interested. It's about that there is no place at the local cemetery. It's not like the big war story. It's like but this town became very engaged. A lot of new audience came to them with this topic, and they were really surprised, saying, like, we didn't expect. People who never read us wanted to know that. What was later very interesting, it was February 2022, sorry. It was like 3 weeks prior to the invasion. And starting to make these stories when something was boiling on the other side and with the war, all of a sudden, numerous people, even from the other side, were writing to them and telling, something is going on. And they felt like they're the part of this community. because they did something which served this community. The initial trust has been built. Therefore, I strongly believe if there is a bad Telegram chat or very, with a lot of hype, tabloid is tabloid. It still will have its millions. But if you do it right, if you really find the questions which are relevant, none of the coordinators or administrators of the chat who is just lazily, do the pictures very fast from internet would compete with the one who asks a really important question for the community. So I as you see, I strongly believe that we do have something. We know how to be useful. We know how to ask the questions.
I find that inspiring. That the faith in journalism is something that I definitely want to believe in, and it's sort of fundamental to the democratic theory, even, that openness is and transparency is sort of essential for an informed public. So it's so encouraging to hear you say that. But at the same time, there's a little voice inside my head that's sort of saying, maybe part of the problem is that if you're not committed to the truth, you can make your stories as interesting as you want. And that if you are committed, you're sort of people who want to tell the truth are constrained by it in a way. You have to go out and find the cemetery story. Whereas I kept on thinking, as you were talking about in the US example, the QAnon phenomenon. The QAnon's biggest, I don't know if it's the biggest success story, but one of their infamous stories is that Hillary Clinton was trafficking underage immigrants through a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. for nefarious sexual purposes. Totally absurd. It's a step away from, Elvis has lunch with aliens in a Kalamazoo Burger King. It's so absurd, and yet it found whatever resonance it had. That somebody went with an arsenal of guns to that pizza parlor to rescue the captives from the basement because they believed it. And then the pizza parlor thing became like people didn't actually have to believe that particular part of the story to think, well, yeah, the Democratic elites are all child traffickers anyways, because there had to be something to that story, or else it wouldn't have been said. All of it, to me, there's this. One of the things that you're up against as a good journalist is that, bad journalism, disingenuous journalism, has this advantage of being, sensationalism is easy when you're not beholden to the truth. And
I do understand it. And look, I'm also speaking from the position we have the whole country near us with millions of people who believing into some imagined reality, which is also, has a human, because of this, human lose their lives. It's extremely serious, and they won't believe, their parents and the relatives, but would believe the news. So I understand how dangerous it is, but I want to move this talk with not just good and bad and sensational. We won't be able to compete with sensational in some way. That's why I use this term useful. I won't make more fancy story. I just can't. And by the way, it was also very unfortunate moment, which for me was very difficult when I was running this independent TV station, especially when there was no actual big events. I'm speaking about 17, 18, 19, and how difficult we were funded as an NGO. It was hardly possible to fundraise, and a lot of donors were trying to teach us how to do better clicks. And I said, look, we in our team all came from the commercial media. It's not like we don't know how to make kind of tabloid or type of the headlines. The problem is we actually don't want to do them. If we would do that, then why do we need to have this public interest media? But I think I can't think about anything else but by being useful, which is a bit different. And I think in this regard, if we get to COVID or something like that, I understand that there would be always some people which are prone to conspiratorial thinking, and depending on how developed your democracy is, how healthy is your society, how proper are political debates, and all other factors, there is probably correlation between the amount of people prone to conspiratorial thinking. You know, it's about like actually the good governance. But I strongly believe that we can't be possessed fully by this just idea. And if even there are 3 or 5 or 7 or 10% of conspiratorial thinkers, yes, we need to work. But there is something which is happening with the majority, which is overseen and which can be reached out, to which we don't do any effort. We're so paranoid. And that's why probably I won't be able now to think that if somebody strongly believes that killing Ukrainians is okay and serving in the Russian army and that's their family thing, I don't think I'll be able to persuade. But I think that there is enough of people who have their own doubts about this war, who do not understand how scary it is, how actually, you know, tragic it is, and why we need to think about, you know, for instance, about the war crimes in a different way. And they still lack some of the information. I kept on coming to a different audience who say like, we didn't know that's happening. We didn't know that it is. There are still so many people to reach with some reasonable way, and we can't ignore. And it can't be very opportunistic. It cannot be like, today we want to reach this, today we want to reach this. You know, now Ukrainians want to reach the Republicans because the Trump will be coming to the White House. A year ago, we thought like, why we need to speak about the Americans? Americans are on our side. It should be like just saying like, we tell the story to everybody, but it's okay to tailor the story, not to tailor and to invent something, but to find these relations and appeals, which I strongly believe can be found in a way. And if we have this majority, a solid majority, maybe then these conspiratorial ideas wouldn't be considered as something which dominate. But as you see, I'm really trying to say that, like, I don't think we need to speak from the point of extremes, because, you know, like, and trying to challenge, because if we get this, we're in this trap. And again, like, could you imagine if I would sit now for half an hour and would just try to debunk all the Russians, fakes and myth? You'd be bored. I'll be very proud to debunk them, but none of the audience would care about that, because would say like, so what? And what would you remain in your mind with a bunch of kind of confusing, debunk, crazy information? But what it would serve to us.
Right. No, that struck me too, is that it's the story that, you know, Ukraine is crawling with Nazis is false but interesting. The story Ukraine is not crawling with Nazis is true, but because it's true, it's almost uninteresting in a way. Like, oh well, that's, you know, you wouldn't want to listen to someone describing, debunking a theory unless you already believed it in a way. I think debunking is such a challenge in that respect, is that you have to be interesting as you debunk. I noticed a question just popped up from an anonymous attendee, and we have a few more minutes. I hope you don't mind if I ask it. The question is, would you like to share the impact of disinformation upon the hope of people in the occupied area?
So it's really differs in different times and in different places. I think I couldn't have imagined in the how, in fact, lack of information, how also it impacts people. I remember I was meeting the people, and I'm speaking now, I'm starting with that, who just left from Mariupol, who didn't have their phones for, 2 weeks. It's not that much if you speak about 2 years, but they really didn't understand if Kiev stands. I wouldn't, like, for me, coming from Kiev, I was like, why people have some weird thoughts? But they were really told that the country isn't there any longer, that, Kiev is occupied. And I heard it everywhere. Now I still believe that the world, despite of the lack of the internet and like some physical means to shut down the internet in the occupied territories and the Ukrainian connection, I also think that overall it's often a matter of choice. You can find a way to find the information. What is interesting for me, so I think that people who want, they largely know what's going on, but they still are in different environments. They feel less secure. They would be more suspicious about some of the things. But what's interesting for me is what's happening with the Crimea. So as somebody who was reporting from the peninsula during these, let's say, calm years, however, there were repressions, however, was like a lot of political persecutions in there, I felt that people in Crimea felt a bit depressed and an idea they don't see the way out. And in the long run, they started to accept the reality as they are. The big war challenged this idea, and I see that they don't see the Crimea as Russian as a dogma, as something which would be always like that. So I think that in occupation, the prospect of liberation matters a lot. And there would be always the people who would accept that we need to accept this reality as it is, because we don't see the prospect of liberation. So we need to find all the excuses why we are where we are. And one of the person to whom I talked, one of our witnesses and survivors who've been tortured in a very brutal way in Kherson region, when I met him and he was showing this prison cell where he was, he right away told me that he's writing a book about his experience, and told right away that he devotes this book. He said, like, it would be devoted to the faithful. And I asked, but who the faithful are? And he actually said that the faithful are those people who, despite everything, believe that we will be liberated. So I think that it really very much depends. Maybe one interesting moment, which I mentioned with the Russian occupation, in particular, there is something like, there is a term about Potemkin village. And we wrote with Anna Pilbaum in the Peaceful Atlantic about that, because I was given this idea by the village head we talked to. And I really thought about that as a bit like Potemkin occupation, where in fact they occupied the territories not really to control and to do something, and because they're really even incapable to do something, to run a proper healthcare system, to run a proper education, to govern, and like govern in our way, even if it would be a wrong way, but to govern. But often some of the things were done for the filming, as it was the story about the teachers, which for me was striking, when one of the teacher was forced to return and told to return to the school because schools were closed, and said okay, you don't need to bring children to study, but bring them so we'll make the film about that. And they would send this film to Moscow or wherever to show as if it's there. So I do think that with this, as we don't see the proper real way of and I do think it's really part of the Russian trap, that at least communists had some ideology to impose something, but it's also a very corrupt regime, and the people on the ground do a lot of things just to show to their bosses. And that's why, because there is this lack of real action, it doesn't make life of the people easier, but people know that these authorities are there, not permanent. They didn't come to do something. They come to show as if they're in control. They're in control in a military way, but they are not in control as we would speak about the government and those who do something.
Oh, thank you so much, Natalia, for that answer. And we have some gratitude from the audience as well for your answer. So thank you so much for joining us today, for your really informative talk, for hearing out our questions, and just for the incredible work that you do. It's the kind of thing that makes your heart move, and you know that there's good out there and better to come. So thank you for all of that, for being here. I'll just point our audience to, in the chat, I dropped the link for the next talk and for the remainder of the series. Our next meeting is on March 8th at 4 p.m. For a talk called Barbarophilia with Professor George Saramis from Yale University in the Hellenic Studies program. So we'll look forward to that. And again, thank you so much, Natalia, for your time, for joining us, for staying up late. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you, Natalia. It's been wonderful hearing from you and hearing your perspectives. Encouraging as well. It's nice to have a dose of optimism in a bleak landscape.
But I hope I'm not the last optimist. Sometimes I feel like, but I don't want to be. Okay.
No,
Publicly, it's the public optimism.
Yeah. Okay.
I
Thank you for the invitation. Bye. Good to
Thanks for
meet
coming.
you. Bye.
Yeah. Take care. Bye-bye.